Europe that's gone distraction and drowsiness today, right? We've got the Insurance Institute, as David explained, putting out protocols around assisted driving in particular. And as JT said, we've got NHTSA now coming out with, got focus on impaired driving. We look at these threats to safety, distraction, drowsiness, driver engagement, impairment, intoxication. It's almost like a perfect storm now, a positive perfect storm, if you will, where it's all coming together from all different parts of the world.
All right. Thank you for coming to our webinar sponsored by Seeing Machines and also Yoshida Report. What we talk about today is impaired driving prevention technology. This is actually a pretty big deal when you think about the NHTSA, U.S. National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, just came out, issued what they call advance notice of proposed rulemaking that sort of lays the groundwork for making impaired prevention technology a standard in new passenger vehicles. So there's a lot to chew on, and a lot of technology inside that we need to discuss. So let's get started on this. And I think I should also note that this announcement was made in conjunction with the very high-profile campaign in the United States. Is called Drive Sober or Get Pulled Over. And I think this is something that very high on everybody's mind who think about safety on the road. And I think we have come a long way. All right. So first, I also want to actually preface that NHTSA's announcement specifically mentioned driver monitoring system. I think in the context of the ANPRM, this is the advanced notice of proposed rulemaking. This is the first time I think NHTSA actually mentions DMS, driver monitoring system, as part of the technical solution that should be considered. All right. Today, first I'd like to introduce the great panelists that we have today. And we are going to start with, myself is Junko Yoshida. I'm the editor-in-chief of the OYR Yoshida Report. And I'd like to, the guest that we have is the David Zuby, Executive Vice President and Chief Research Officer at IIHS. Hi, David.
Good afternoon. Glad to be here with you guys.
All right. And then we've got Dr. Michael Lune, Chief Science and Innovation Officer at Seeing Machine. Hi, Mike.
G'day, Junko. Pleasure to talk to you again.
All right. And of course, we've got JT Griffin, the principal at the Griffin Strategies and consultant to Seeing Machine. Hi, JT.
Good afternoon, Junko. Thanks for having me.
Great. So before we get started, I asked each panelist to introduce himself and what each person does in connection with today's topic, prevention of drunk driving. All right, let's start with David.
So the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety is a nonprofit organization that is sponsored by companies that sell automobile insurance in the United States and Canada. We have been in existence for more than 60 years, and our mission is basically to conduct research that leads to solutions to the problem that is created by highway crashes. We've studied impaired driving, alcohol impaired driving, and other forms of impaired driving throughout the history of the Insurance Institute. And currently, we are working on driver monitoring systems in the context of partial automation systems. We're concerned that as automakers provide driving automation or partial automation as a feature on their cars, some of them are not doing enough to make sure that drivers are paying the supervisory role that is necessary of these designs.
All right, let's go to Mike.
Yeah, look, from a personal viewpoint, I've spent my career engaging in research to understand driver behaviour and to develop solutions to improve road safety. And I was doing that in a university setting for 15 years. And nearly 10 years ago, I thought, well, look, I'd like to move a bit closer to where the solutions are and direct the research straight into technology development. So I moved to Seeing Machines and now find myself running innovation at Seeing Machines. So all the advanced R&D, all the technology development. And as a company, as a 23-year-old company, we've been focused on these problems around supporting safe driving behaviour across that time. And we are, of course, a leading provider of driver monitoring systems in the industry. So, from an R&D perspective, from a technology development perspective, and I guess from an engagement in policy perspective, we're really sort of at the front wave of this DMS evolution and implementation across those three areas.
Okay. Now moving on to JT.
Well, thank you, Junko. And again, thanks for inviting me to this panel. I have been in Washington for over 20 years now. Started out my career on Capitol Hill, working for a senior member of Congress and working on appropriations and transportation, commerce, and technology issues. And then left the Hill to run a government relations and communications office for a big nonprofit here in the United States, Mothers Against Drunk Driving. And there I really focused on efforts to eliminate drunk driving in the United States, which is one of the biggest killers on our roadways. And had an opportunity to, having worked on legislation that helped set up what was the rulemaking that I think we're going to talk a little bit about today, had the opportunity to come work with a company that's actually making the technology that's going to eliminate those deaths and injuries through distraction, impairment, and drowsiness. And so it was just a great opportunity to come, hopefully finish what I started and save a lot of lives. So I'm really excited to be part of the Seeing Machines team and looking forward to seeing that technology come to fruition.
Thank you. All right. So before getting into that, what NHTSA is up to with this advanced notice of rulemaking, I'd like us to touch upon what's going on in Europe. Maybe Mike, you can explain that this whole drunk driving prevention technology that is actually already being implemented in Europe, is it not?
So driver monitoring solutions are absolutely being implemented in Europe as we speak, with an initial focus on distraction and drowsiness, but a deliberate evolution to alcohol intoxication and other forms of impairment, as you described. And it really did start in sort of 2015-16 with reports conducted by the European Commission, primarily by the Transport Research Laboratory in the UK. And 10 years later, we now have regulations in Europe that will require all new cars and trucks from 1 July 2024 to have a form of drowsiness and attention warning technology. And from the 1st of July 2026, all new cars and trucks must have a form of advanced driver distraction systems. And so that's terrific because it requires these systems to be in the market, right? So step one achieved. Step two is how do we work on providing a framework that provides incentives for manufacturers and suppliers to push the envelope on performance and the safety benefit that can be achieved. And from my perspective, that's really where Euro NCAP comes in, because the regulations for drowsiness and distraction set a reasonable but modest bar on performance. But they achieve their goal, they introduce the systems to the market. And what Euro NCAP's done, and we've been thrilled to support that, is really provide a protocol that provides a range of performance. It specifies a much higher range of performance, and it gives the OEMs a spectrum and suppliers a spectrum of performance to aim for. So it rewards those OEMs that do look to push the boundaries on safety for driver monitoring. And it really does, I think, it's certainly in our submissions to NHTSA, and I'm sure we'll talk about this later. We rely very heavily on the success that's been achieved in Europe from the regulation and policy side as a feeder to what we hope will happen in the United States.
All right. So in other words, that if that is being already, sort of Europe has done a kind of heavy lifting so far, what sort of impact did it have, or has it had on the OEMs? Can anybody comment? I mean, what's the impact of Euro NCAP's requirement on, generally speaking, of the car makers so far?
Well, I have a view, but David, do you want to go?
Well, I was going to say, I think in Europe already you start seeing more and more automobile products being delivered to customers with driver monitoring systems on board in anticipation of needing to meet these regulatory guidelines, but also in an attempt to earn more points toward a higher star rating. A little bit of that has trickled over into the United States market. We do see some automakers who are offering driver monitoring systems for sort of general purpose distraction fatigue kind of warnings, but the more common use in the U.S. market tends to be in conjunction with partial automation systems, where automakers are saying, okay, we've got the customer paying for this automation feature. We can afford to add in a driver monitoring to make sure that those customers are using the system the way we intend.
All right. So
perhaps Junko, could I just add very quickly? I think from an industry perspective, I think what we're seeing very clearly is, 10 years ago, the first questions we were asked was, does it work outside? Does it work in a car? Does it work with sunglasses, et cetera, et cetera? 5 years ago, the questions we were asked was, so when you measure distraction or drowsiness, what does that mean? How do you characterize that? The first question we get asked at the moment is, how do you perform against Euro NCAP? And so from a change in behaviour viewpoint, at least, from my viewpoint, from the initial engagement, it's definitely had, I think, the desired impact.
Wow, that is quite a transition that the industry has already seen. So picking up where you left off. So what's the difference between what Europe has done and what the US is trying to do now? David, can you explain?
Yeah, so I think, Europe and the United States work in similar ways. That is, there is regulation that sort of sets the low bar for safety features. And then there are consumer information programs that provide incentive for automakers who want to use higher levels of safety to market their products to their customers. In the United States, we have a new car assessment program that is run by the United States Department of Transportation, but we also have the efforts of IIHS. We have been, since 1994, providing safety ratings on new cars that look at aspects of safety different from the aspects of safety that are judged by the new car assessment program. So I think in that way, the two systems work in similar way, although they're not always in sync with each other. As I mentioned, in our role, as we're thinking about driver monitoring systems, we're mainly trying to make sure that those automakers who are fitting partial automation systems are also using driver monitoring to make sure that drivers are fulfilling their role as a supervisor for that automation.
Yeah. All right. So I'm going to go to JT because as a consummate expert of Washington, maybe you can explain that what NHTSA is trying to get out of this. Where are we? I mean, are we going to see the technology like DMS going to be finally mandated in the United States? What's your view on this?
Well, I think the first thing is to give NHTSA some credit for issuing, in the Department of Transportation, some credit for issuing this this advance notice of proposed rulemaking. I think if you take a deep dive into some of the details of what they're asking for, the request is centered around alcohol and alcohol impairment. And that's because the infrastructure law, which was passed about 2 years ago, from Congress, specifically requires DOT to begin a rulemaking on technology regarding alcohol impairment. But where I think NHTSA gets a lot of credit is a little outside of the box thinking in terms of if technology is available for alcohol, what else can that technology solve? And I know from conversations with NHTSA staff that they're very keen to address the issue of distraction. There was a report that came out earlier this year that NHTSA funded, that they published, that found distracted driving deaths in the United States are causing over 10,000 deaths every year. And it found that distraction is actually the highest cause, or the highest cost of related to vehicle crashes, injuries, and things like that. So I think from NHTSA's perspective, they're looking at this as, if there's a technology that can solve alcohol, that's great. But if that same technology could address vehicle distraction and drowsiness, then we want to know about it. So I think NHTSA really deserves some kudos for that, because, one thing that's important, NHTSA can begin a rulemaking at any time. They don't have to have the requirement in an infrastructure bill or in some sort of legislation. It's up to NHTSA to do that. And so I give them credit for including these other behavioral causes of traffic deaths and injuries, for including that as part of the rulemaking. In terms of the rulemaking moving forward, an ANPRM is the beginning of the process. This is the announcement of a very formal rulemaking process that NHTSA is going to undertake in the Department of Transportation. It can be a long process. The ANPRM itself is designed to give NHTSA more information about how these technologies work. So I think it's going to be really important as NHTSA starts this journey of improving safety, that consumer groups, OEMs, technology groups like Seeing Machines, all contribute to the solution and share what they're comfortable with about how technology works and how it can solve this problem. I know from Seeing Machines' perspective, there is a huge opportunity here to stop distracted driving, and that's something that and Mike can talk more about that. But the technology, as Mike and David both mentioned, is being used in Europe right now. And one of the big initiatives with the spike in traffic deaths and injuries has been the United States adopting a safe systems approach, which Europe has been doing for some time now. And part of that safe systems approach is really a focus on technology. And as someone who's been in traffic safety for a long time now, I really believe that technology is the way forward to stopping some of these traffic deaths on the roadways. We've gotten a lot out of enforcement campaigns. You mentioned the Drive Sober, Get Pulled Over campaign. But the truth is, and you hear a lot about culture too, but the truth is everybody knows you shouldn't talk on the phone or use your phone and drive distracted. You shouldn't drive drunk. We've known that for 40 years now, 43 years since MAD was founded in 1980. And yet people still do it. And it causes, well over 30,000 deaths every year, and they're all preventable. And so with a technology like driver monitoring, you potentially have the opportunity to stop all of these behavioral deaths in the United States. So I think this rulemaking, it's the first piece in the process, but I think ultimately the technology works. And so I think NHTSA will implement this rulemaking and create a new rule and require this technology.
All right.
I actually think, JT,
go ahead.
it's almost like this World Wide Web of regulation is now all converging. We've got Europe that's gone distraction and drowsiness today, right? We've got the Insurance Institute, as David explained, putting out protocols around assisted driving, in particular. And as JT said, we've got NHTSA now coming out with, got focus on impaired driving. So it's almost like when we look at these threats to safety, distraction, drowsiness, driver engagement, impairment, intoxication, there are different drivers in different parts of the world, but they're all sort of it's almost like a perfect storm now, a positive perfect storm, if you will, where it's all coming together from all different parts of the world. And the end result is going to be, this sort of singular approach that can tackle all of these problems in both driving today and in driving tomorrow as levels of driver assistance unfold. So I think it's a really exciting time in that regard.
That's a good summary, though, right? Yeah. Go ahead, David.
It's clear from the law that JT mentioned, NHTSA has to focus on alcohol impaired driving, but when you study the statistics, the problem of impaired driving generally, regardless of what is causing the impairment, is much bigger than alcohol by itself. And I think that is the opportunity for driver monitoring systems. There are technologies that can detect the level of alcohol in a person's body, but those systems don't necessarily get at impaired behavior, which generally is a bigger problem than alcohol by itself.
Yeah, that leads to my next question, because my understanding is that, especially in the United States, I was actually kind of surprised when I was talking to some people in a conference that people have some problems with especially the alcohol detection system, because technologies do exist that measures the level of alcohol in blood, right? And people worry about, well, how accurate is it, and why do I have to do this? There's a privacy issue. I don't know. I mean, people throw out all those, question marks to the measuring the blood alcohol content. So, David, can you explain a little bit what the controversy is, and how are we going to, argue against that?
Yeah, well, I think some of the controversy is just noise. There are
a lot of times they are, yes.
There are always people who don't want, technology or the government or automakers to tell them how they should behave behind the wheel of a car. There is a certain segment of the population in the United States that absolutely refuse to wear their seatbelts, which is completely ridiculous.
Right.
But I think, in the context of this discussion, we do have a recent survey of nationally representative opinions that says there's stronger support for technology that can prevent alcohol impaired driving and fatigue driving than for things like limiting speed. And in fact, while there's generally a majority support for preventing distracted driving, it is less well appreciated by the American public than trying to prevent alcohol impaired driving. So I think there's a range of opinions about things, but generally the support for technology that can make the road safer is there.
All right. Yeah, one of the arguments that I heard about that, people who are against the measuring blood alcohol content is what about drugs? Can you measure how much drug the intake was by checking the blood? There's always this "what about this" kind of argument. But when it comes to the impairment, how large the impairment issues that are we trying to deal with this? Do we know?
Like JT mentioned, alcohol impairment and distraction are the biggest problems. When you start looking at other impairing substances, the number of injury crashes or fatal crashes that are associated with people having imbibed in those substances is much lower than it is for alcohol. Alcohol has been a problem since the very beginning of driving, and so it is well studied. And there are very discrete laws around what defines impairment by alcohol, whereas some of the other drugs, especially those that are like becoming legal in the United States, there's less information about the relationship between the intake of the drug and its effect on your safe driving behavior.
Hey, David,
Okay.
just on the way that the different systems are interpreted, particularly with alcohol. I guess you mentioned that there are some approaches that measure the level, and Junko, you mentioned approaches that measure the actual level of alcohol in the blood. And I guess historically, in parts of the world, that's an approach, that is, I think, highly effective in a sort of an alcohol interlock model, which is a punitive measure for drivers who, potentially, found guilty of drink driving. So I think it is a really interesting issue as to what's the place of approaches that measure an absolute level, and what's the place of approaches that measure changes in your behavior that can be linked to impairment. What are the policymakers looking for? What are the OEMs looking for? What's technologically possible? And what's the community going to accept? And I'm not sure, David, on your sense, but I wonder if that sort of spectrum is in part contributing to some of the sort of active discussion about acceptance, and there may be different views on those two different approaches by different stakeholders.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true, but I think the other thing that that's affected there is the number of people that engage in these things. I think there are a lot higher number of people who admit to engaging in distracting behaviors than would admit to driving at illegal levels of alcohol impairment.
Yeah.
One of the specific concerns about alcohol impairment technology is that people don't want to blow into a device to start the car because most people aren't drunk most of the time. Why do I have to take this extra step to start my car? The law is requiring NHTSA to actually come up with a way to measure alcohol passively so that you don't have to do something to start the car. An advantage of detecting that somebody is illegal before they start the car is they never get on the road.
Yeah.
But that is going to miss a whole bunch of other impaired driving behavior that you'd like to intervene with other technology on the car to try to reduce the risk of crashing. And I think that's where the driver monitoring, can amplify the effects of what is minimally required by the law that Congress passed.
I may be getting ahead of myself, but imagine myself as had a little bit of wine and got on the car, and the my car with the driver monitoring system detects that I maybe had a little bit maybe a little tipsy, but not so much. But when DMS detects that, how does because the car already let me drive. I have started driving, right? How is the car designed to stop me from driving further?
Either of you guys want to take that?
Well,
I mean, I think that there are a range of different interventions that the car might make upon detecting that a driver is impaired in some way, right? If it occurs before the car is in motion, it can deny the driver the ability to put the car in motion. And,
right.
But that's pretty limiting, and it could have consequences that not all drivers accept. But once the trip is underway, there are things that can be done, like alerting a driver to the fact that he's distracted may help him refocus his attention on the driving task. Alerting a driver that he's fatigued might help a driver make the decision to pull over and get a cup of coffee. Alerting a driver that he's impaired by alcohol, because alcohol impairs judgment, may not result in the driver taking steps himself to drive more safely, but the car could, for instance, limit the speed at which it's allowed to operate. And you limit the speed, you limit the consequences of any crashes that happen, but you also reduce the likelihood of crashes occurring in the first place. Cars are increasingly equipped with technology that controls certain aspects of the vehicle's motion in response to sensors looking out into the world. The tunings for those systems could change in response to a system detecting that a driver is impaired, thereby increasing sort of the safety margin that those safety systems provide anyway.
100%. And actually, that's the approach that's been taken with Euro NCAP, right? Is the earlier stages, are potentially warning only, but it needs to support an eventual intervention, which, as David said, could be priming some other safety systems like, fall collision warning systems, lane departure systems. So the car is going to know that the driver is not quite as fit to drive as they should be, and will have the opportunity to prime or get ready some of the other safety systems, potentially between an early warning and a late stage intervention. But I mean, this is literally where the rubber hits the road with this type of approach.
And in extreme cases, the car could bring itself safely to a stop, or even pull itself off to the side of the road and summon help for somebody who has, become unconscious because of too much alcohol or possibly a medical condition has created a situation that makes it hard for them to carry on.
Yeah, and I would add, David, that's a really good point, that that technology exists right now. I mean, you see systems like the General Motors Super Cruise system, the Ford Blue Cruise system. Those systems, if the driver is using it and is not paying attention or engaged in driving as the car tells it to, tells the driver to, then the car can pull itself over. Those are in stretches of road where the roads are mapped, but it is an option for the vehicle. So I think what's important about this is the technology exists and it can be done right now. And I think that's really important as we talk about rulemakings, because NHTSA is going to want to see technology. They like to see things right now, not things necessarily, in the future. And I think that's a difference between the way Europe has approached this, which is let's set a goal and have everybody meet the goal. The United States likes to see something that's available here now. They can touch it and feel it, and then require that. So I think this will help with an eventual rulemaking for this technology.
Let's talk about, that's a good point, JT. I think let's talk about the difference between Europe and the US for a little bit, because my understanding is that drivers in Europe are actually a lot more cautious when you talk, when you go out dinner with some Europeans in a European city, and if he had one glass of wine, I mean, he actually prevents himself from driving. I mean, in the United States, that's not going to happen. 2 glasses of wine, 3 glasses of wine. It depends on who that is. But the permissiveness for the drunk driving in the United States is far greater than Europe. If that is the case, I mean, I'm just making an assumption here. If that is the case, the rule should be different, or the technology should be applied differently. What is your view on this?
Well, I'll jump in real quickly. I don't think the rules should be different. I mean, I think, impairment is impairment. And I think that, yes, we culturally look at things a little differently in the United States than Europeans do. But I think, when you look at their numbers, they're very different than what our numbers are. Same thing with the numbers in Australia as well. So I don't think it makes sense to look at this differently. I think that, the technology is looking at impairment, and with driver monitoring, the system looks at it differently than an alcohol detection system. It is not going to be detecting a 0.08. And Mike, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I always feel a little funny talking about this when I've got you on the phone, but the system is not going to, look at 0.08. It's going to look at impairment. And so I think that's going to be a different way of thinking about the challenge, and then thinking about solutions. And so, and I think 0.08 is a very, it's the most generous level of alcohol allowed in the world.
Yeah.
And so, impairment begins before 0.08. The NTSB in the United States and most of the major safety groups now have endorsed a 0.05. I'm not suggesting that the system be set at 0.05. What I'm saying is that, the issue is impairment, not necessarily a BAC limit.
Mm.
Yeah, I think that's right, that both the legal limit for alcohol impairment in Europe is lower than it is in the United States, and I think people are aware of that leeway. But the other thing is that people in Europe, to the extent that they do behave differently, do so because they believe they will get caught if they are driving illegally impaired by alcohol. Whereas I think in the United States, people are less likely to think that they'll get caught. There's plenty of research that shows that if you carry out checkpoints to check, to assess whether or not drivers are impaired by alcohol, you can achieve quite low levels in those areas of impaired driving, because it increases the perception among the general population that people will get caught if they disregard care about driving impaired.
All right. Now that's a good point. Now, all three of you actually use the word impairment, right? And that means that the sources of it, whether it's alcohol, drowsiness, or distraction, the behavior itself manifests itself impaired. Is that? I mean, I'm just trying to. I'm struggling to understand, how do you define impairment, and how the science shows differently for drowsiness and fatigue and drunk driving in the eyes of the driver monitoring system.
Great question. That's a tough one to answer in a minute or so, but it's a really, really important question, because for some areas like alcohol, there is a legal limit and there is an approach to measuring that. For other behaviours like distraction and drowsiness and impairment broadly, there's no sort of legal test, right? So the approach has been, in a large part of the industry, certainly our approach is around measuring behaviour when people are distracted or drowsy or intoxicated or impaired by something else, and basically looking to see how do fundamental aspects of their behaviour change in terms of their ocular behaviour, for example, the extent to which they're able to process information from the driving scene. How does their glance behaviour, their eyelid behaviour change? And how does that relate to changes in performance, so changes in driving performance? So it's really trying to take a performance impairment approach. So trying to define, we know, for example, with drowsiness, right, the predominant crash type, and David is much better placed than I to talk about this, but the predominant crash type from my previous life and understanding was a run-off road, single vehicle crash, or a single vehicle, a crossing the centre lane into oncoming traffic. But it's typically, a single vehicle run-off road, particularly outside metropolitan areas. So you're looking for, and we know from crash data that there are a lot of drivers who make no vehicle response in the 5 seconds prior to these sort of crashes. This comes from a crash study done at Monash University. And so we're effectively looking for sort of the absence of input in a lot of cases. We're looking for changes in glance behaviour, changes in attention to the road, correlating that with changes in driving performance, be they erratic measures like excessive steering, or the absence of input, basically to come up with a hard performance sort of indicator, that sort of framework about what impairment looks like. Now, there will be safety groups around the world, I'm sure, who are thinking very, very intently and deeply about this particular topic, because it's possibly a more acceptable route for the community. And you gave an example before, Junko, when you get in your car.
Yeah.
Do you want the car to tell? What do you want the car to tell you in that situation? Do you want the car to tell you you're over 0.05 and you're a drunk?
No, I don't want to be told.
Do you want the car to tell you that you're not fit to drive? Do you want the car
it's like
to tell you
having a mother in my car?
Yeah, but I mean, it's sort of when you unpack exactly what you as a driver, the information that you would find acceptable. Do you want yeah? So that I think is, when you unpack it, it's quite complex, and I think that's why converging to a sort of a performance impairment pathway is actually the more solid sort of approach. That's my 2 cents anyway.
Interesting. Yeah. There's a lot of psychology involved in this. I mean, do I listen to the car, right? I mean, it's yeah. That's
yeah. I mean,
I think this idea of general impairment is kind of new in the field, because up until a few years ago, it was impaired by this or impaired by that, or doing bad behavior. But the conversation has changed to, can we distinguish safe driving from unsafe driving, where unsafe driving is kind of synonymous with impaired driving, and not worry about the cause. But to the extent that you do need to worry about the cause, the interventions might be different, right? Because in the example of somebody who is distracted by a message on their mobile phone, a reminder to pay attention to the road might change that behavior instantaneously. But in the case of somebody who is sick or impaired by alcohol, where their judgment is impaired, you probably need a different intervention than just saying, "Hey, you're drunk," because the person's going to say, "Of course I know I'm drunk, but I'm still going to go home."
Yeah. Wow. That's like, so after detecting impairment, what you do is sort of like another set of topics that really needs to be examined in a way. Yeah. I'm going to ask some kind of scheduling questions, because after NHTSA, I think David was telling me before this call that the NHTSA will formally put out NPRM on the federal registration, and when federal register, when that's done, that's when the clock starts ticking for the industry to respond or the comment. Is that right, David?
That's correct. The ANPRM is out there in the public, but because it's not been published in the Federal Register, the clock for the comment period has not started.
And what's the usual time period from comment period?
The usual time period, and the one that is stated in the ANPRM, which was released to the public, is 60 days.
60 days.
And as we were talking before, I think you can almost guarantee that there are going to be parties who want to comment who are going to ask NHTSA for an extension.
Usually they do, yes.
Yeah, because NHTSA raises lots of questions. I forget the count, but it's close to 100 questions. And anybody who wants to do a thorough job of trying to provide information to NHTSA is probably going to take more than 60 days to come up with good answers and good data for them.
Is it fair to assume that we might have some kind of responses or the determination by NHTSA a year from now?
In my experience, I would say that would be the earliest that you could expect the next phase of the rulemaking process to occur.
Okay.
And that could get disrupted by the fact that next year in this country we're having another presidential election. If a new president is elected, and even if the old president is reelected, that could result in changes in leadership in cabinet ministries like the Department of Transportation, which could result in some realigning of priorities. But they are on the hook by law passed by Congress to try to get something done by, I think, is it 2025? Yeah, I think so. Right.
Yeah. All right. But before closing, though, I think that one of the things, one of the takeaways for me is rather than having a separate technology installed in a car to measure the impairment, it looks like DMS has become, I shouldn't say be all end all, but it's like it's kind of a covering the large landscape of measuring or detecting impairment in driving. Is that fair to say that, Mike?
Look, I think so. And from an innovation sort of viewpoint, you sort of think, well, for the first time, there's the ability to capture, really in-depth information about vehicle occupants, and particularly their cognitive state, right? We're not measuring the performance of an engine cylinder under the bonnet here. We're measuring effectively the cognitive state of people, right? And that's a challenging thing to do. So, when you think you've got this sort of new opportunity to look inside the cabin, and it's really, I mean, we have some safety drivers, obviously, but when you observe video in research studies, for example, and look at behavior in a car, and if you watch that for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, half an hour, and you'll find that all these little things pop in your head. Oh, why is the driver doing that? Oh, that happens before that happens. Oh, okay. You get this sort of really in-depth understanding. And I think, yes, the focus has been rightly on distraction and drowsiness and now alcohol. But you sort of think, well, the sort of possibilities are sort of endless. You look at young driver behavior, fitness to drive generally. I mean, there are lots of applications, and we haven't even talked about the passive safety side here, where this sort of information starts triggering, really core systems such as airbags and so forth. So, it works in conjunction with other vehicle systems, right? It's the integration of what's happening inside the vehicle, which is now possible, with what's happening, in terms of driving performance from CAN bus or other vehicle sensors, and what's happening outside in terms of what is the actual risk outside the vehicle, because the opportunity here is not all detection of unsafe behavior. That's rightly a focus, but there's also opportunities here. If the risk is much higher outside the vehicle at a particular point in time, you can change your thresholds. If the risk is much lower because there's no other vehicle around you, there's no pedestrians, maybe the thresholds are relaxed a bit, so there's an opportunity to tailor the safety systems to the actual risk. And I think for the industry and consumers, that's a really exciting possibility that, if done well, could really enhance the acceptance of these systems. So they're effectively, when they go off, when they're activated, you're increasing the certainty that there is actually a more concrete risk, there at the time. So, long answer, but I think the possibilities I think we're scratching the surface.
It is. And especially, exactly. It's not just about monitoring. And DMS is really the first window to look into the people's behavior. And as you said, opportunity is endless when it can be actually integrated with the rest of the vehicle, what vehicle sees exterior of the car itself. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming to the show. It was very, very interesting. I feel like I only scratched the surface. Maybe we can do the part 2. Anyway, thank you so much for coming.
All right. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
All
Thank
right.
you.